Before we get started, let's go ahead and do a very quick sound check. Can you please type 1 into your chat box if you can hear me? All right. Okay. Going ahead and there we go. Great, confirmation that we're good. So first I have to introduce myself. Thanks to Workable and Hired for asking me to sit in on this. My name is Ben Summers. I'm one of the team leads in the dev lab for Bain and Company. We have a group of ex-startup developers doing web development for Bain. I come from a software engineering background, currently operating as an EM on our small team here. And I've worked with Workable and Hired a little bit on some other recruiting-focused events in the past. So I'm going to throw it to our other panelists to introduce themselves. First up, we have Alexis Flores. Alexis.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I'm Alexis, and I'm currently a lead technical recruiter with Quip, which is a startup that got acquired by Salesforce. Here I'm responsible for helping hire engineering leaders specifically for Quip. And prior to my time here, I was with Cisco Meraki, where I helped hire across various different skill sets, everything from security to SRE to engineering leadership. I mean, I'm really passionate about finding creative ways to attract talent and building diverse teams through an inclusive interview process. So always happy to have conversations around those topics.
All right. Brian, let's go ahead and go to you next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Menduk. I am a senior technical recruiter at DraftKings. If you've not heard from us about us, we're in really fancy sports betting industry. Currently, I handle, I've done a few things at DraftKings. Senior software engineers, lead software engineers. I've done campus recruiting. Currently, I'm focused on data science, data engineering, and site reliability engineering. And prior to this, I was at another high-growth tech startup in Boston area called Thinking Phones, which was in the communication space. It's like a Slack competitor. I'm happy to be here today talk about recruiting.
All right, and Corey, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Corey Favre. I'm a software engineer at Hired. I came into software development through a background in math and education, and then did a stint teaching as a web development instructor at General Assembly. So I've seen lots of people go through the job search process from the early stages, and I've gone through it several times myself. I landed here at Hired, where I'm working on a lot of my work has been centered around building mobile optimized onboarding flows. So that's something I've been working on and thinking about a lot just recently.
All right. And Corey and I will be providing the engineering representation on our panel. Alexis and Brian will be providing a little bit more insight from the recruiting side. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into things. So we're going to go through a few quick topics. We're going to talk about sourcing techniques, grabbing attention, how to get that first touch going. We're going to talk a little bit about how to retain people, how to get people interested in your job, how to keep people interested, and then we'll talk a little bit about interview techniques, interview practices, what's changed, what's updated practice, what are people doing now, what aren't they doing anymore, and then we'll have a little time at the end for Q&A. So moving right along then. We're going to start with a quick poll. So just for everyone in our audience here, if you could just let us know with the poll, what you feel like you need the most help with, what you're most interested in, and then we'll see if we can put a little bit more weight, a little bit more emphasis on that as we go through and spend a little extra time if we have to. So just let us know. Um, um, give everybody a couple quick minutes to get through that. All right. That's interesting. We've got some results in, which is a very clear and overwhelming answer. 78% of you have said that you are most interested in help with sourcing and getting attention, which is good because that's the first thing that we're going to be talking about. So we'll definitely spend a lot of time on that, dig pretty deeply into it. And then about even 12% and 10% on our second and third topics, which we'll still spend some time on. But we'll definitely make sure we hit sourcing hard. All right, so moving right along. So let's start talking a little bit about sourcing techniques. So everybody is welcome to respond, but we're sort of going to direct this just to begin. So Alexis, if you want to take us off on our first question, with so much competition around tech talent, it can be difficult to build a good pipeline and manage traditional sourcing. There's so many messages going in, particularly for developers and engineers, that stuff like LinkedIn messages and cold emails often doesn't work. How else can you build a good pipeline? Where do you go to find good talent?
Yeah, great question. And there are a lot of great platforms out there, like Hired, of course, that give you access to candidates who explicitly show that they're open to exploring new opportunities. So that gives you a little bit more of a warm introduction. And I've made quite a few successful hires through Hired. But one other thing that I think is really important is learning more about the community you're sourcing from. Are there any conferences or meetups associated with those skill sets? Can you attend those? Are there reps going from your company? Because that not only shows that you've taken the time to actually learn about the skills that you're looking to support and recruit for, but it gives you the opportunity to really build a long-term relationship with the people you've met. While sometimes we want it to be, recruiting really isn't just a short game. It's about building and nurturing relationships with people and connecting them to the right opportunity when that presents itself, as well as when they're ready to move. If you're having trouble thinking about, okay, how can I reach out to someone about something other than just telling them about a specific rec I'm working on, I think it's important to not be afraid to, maybe share the latest news at your companies, like blogs, news articles. If you're hosting any tech talks or any other types of events, don't be afraid to reach out to them and update people about that. So the next time that they are looking for a new opportunity, they're going to think of you and they're going to think of your company about wanting to reach out to it first.
Yeah, additionally, I guess here at DraftKings, we use tools, like Alexis mentioned, Hired, Stack Overflow. We recently invested in Tello, which helps to provide, find ways to find, someone's email address that we can just more easily follow up that might not be on LinkedIn. Actually, last night at DraftKings, we hosted a local talent acquisition event. We actually had the CEO from Lever speak, and she brings up that reminder that I think a lot of recruiters forget about, which is that your ATS can also be a CRM, and you have thousands and thousands of candidates, especially in high growth companies or really well known companies. You have thousands and thousands of people that are applying that maybe they're not a fit today, but they might be a fit in a year. Maybe there's that new grad that you just can't hire someone right out of school right now, but in a year or two or 3 or 4, that person might have moved on and gotten a great job out of school and now has a great skill set. And you can go back and find their profile really easily. So making sure that you're thinking about using your ATS as more than just a applicant system and also as a CRM type tool. Additionally, like Alexis said, local tech groups. If you have an office that can accommodate a meetup, show off your office. Have people come in. Invite people into your space. Show them, the great office that you have and the environment you have and the great people by hosting an event. That's, I think, a really easy way to, you're not going to actively solicit people there, but they might come in and say, hey, this office was awesome. Like, I really like what they had to say. And, that might drive some interest there, but at least keep getting the word out about branding, about your company. And then from that, you might meet some people that know people, and you can reach out to them and find different ways to really connect with those people. And then additionally, I think one thing that's really growing in the recruiting space is recruitment marketing. We're actually building out a dedicated recruitment marketing team here at DraftKings. So we run a ton of sponsored campaigns targeting software engineers. So the content of those ads are employee testimonials. We think storytelling is an authentic way to differentiate your talent brand. We run sponsored Facebook ads, Reddit ads in Reddit groups, Google SEMs. We have there's a local company called Sufa that puts up digital advertisements like on the sidewalks in Boston, and we have pictures and stories up there. We run display ads in elevators of targeted talent competitors. So if you walk into your Amazon office and you're in an elevator, you see, hey, DraftKings is hiring on the elevator screen. So we're doing a lot on the marketing function to really build that out to help drive brand awareness.
Okay, moving along a little bit. Thank you both for all of that. This one we're going to direct at Corey, and I'll probably chime in a little bit too. What can a recruiter do to actually get you to read email? What does a good email, what does good outreach look like to you, talking from the engineering perspective, from the person who's getting recruited?
Yeah, I may be in the minority where I actually open all of recruiting emails that land in my Gmail inbox. So I think the most important thing is like get your email deliverability up so that it's not landing in spam boxes, it's not getting filtered out of an inbox. That's at least for me. I definitely do read more deeply if the subject line has something about a company that I already know about or I've heard about. I think Brian's point about getting your brand out there, Alexis's point about being out in the community and knowing, the community knowing about you and your brand is a big part of it. If I've seen, a talk at a conference by an engineer from a company and I thought it was interesting, and then an email contains that company's name, I'm far, far more likely to read through that whole email and get into the details of it and possibly respond and find out more. I think also the subject line, if it's not a company name I recognize, a vertical I'm interested in, or an industry that might sort of catch my ear a little bit. And I think good emails that I will read all the way through. They're short and to the point. They aren't asking for much. They're just giving me information. I think it's really nice when they come from either a hiring manager or another technical person, so that I can feel like the person I respond to might be able to talk to me about what the role's details are and about the technical details at that point. And then I also I tend to read more deeply when an email has some justification about the opportunity and why it's a good opportunity, whether it's because the company is growing fast or the team is really stellar and has some really great talent and people I could learn from and work with, or if they can make the argument that their company is making a difference. I think that those are all really good hooks, and if you can find that hook for your company and include that in your email, I think that that's going to get people to engage more with what you're sending out.
It's interesting to hear that you read every single email, because I also consider myself in the minority. I also read every single piece of outreach I get. But I do for my part, I pay a lot of attention. I really hate tricky stuff. Right, so the emails that are like, hey, just following up, when there was never an initial email. The thing where you pretend to have an existing relationship. Any case where it's obvious the way the email's been templated tends to be a pretty big turnoff. Stealth emails for me are a thing that I really hate. You know, the email where you don't talk about the company name, where you aren't open about what the opportunity actually is. I've even gotten ones that are kind of cheeky, where the recruiter, you know, describes the company they're recruiting for, isn't willing to name them, but makes it very clear who they are. You know, I'm recruiting for a company who had a big IPO last week. Like, well, that's not. See, that's just wasting everybody's time. So for my part, I really value when recruiters are very straightforward, very forthright, very sort of businesslike. I also really appreciate the personalized part of the pitch, right? If even if I can tell that, like, you know, paragraph one is generic and paragraph two is personalized, like the fact that they actually have paid attention, they've read my resume, they know what my experience looks like and what I'm interested in, for me, that makes a very big difference. And even if I'm not going to respond today, one thing that I do is, because I read every email and I save them all, uh, a recruiter can email me a year from now, and I will start off by going back, searching, and finding every contact I've ever received from them. And so I pay attention and remember if somebody sent good emails or I had a good experience actually talking with someone before. I do tend to pay attention to that. One of my favorite stories about a good recruiter doing a good job was someone I actually worked very deeply with for a job I wound up not taking. And then just a little while later, that recruiter changed jobs and reached out to me for a different company and a different opportunity. And I was far more likely to listen to her and hear what she had to say because we'd already had such a good experience working together before, even if it wasn't ultimately successful. Um, right. So moving on to our next topic. This one we're gonna open up with Brian here. Um, when do you think it's appropriate to approach candidates on social channels? You know, not just email, not just LinkedIn, but on sort of more personal approaches.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you know the rise of social media goes, I think a lot of people ask themselves, um, you know, I reach out to someone on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, um, and I think it's pretty tricky. I wouldn't even sit here and pretend to be an expert in social and networking recruiting. It's definitely a tricky space. I think when candidates are publicly discussing, potentially a trending topic on a platform like Twitter, I think it's definitely okay to reach out to them because they're publicly talking about it. They want to have some discussions about what they're talking about. If a software engineer is tweeting about, let's say, an Angular conference or something like that, and they're participating in that trending topic, we may use, a tool like Intello to help find their contact information, their email address, and reference how we found them in their outreach and say, hey, saw your awesome post, on Twitter. We're sending a few engineers to that conference as well. You should definitely meet up and grab a drink with them or something while you're out there. Um, and just find some way to relate to them that way. Because that way it shows that we're going the extra mile to find them, and personally engage them about a role that's relevant. It's not just, hey, saw you're going to this conference, I see you're, and they're a front end developer, but you're like, here's this, back end embedded, engineering role or something like that. So making sure that we're, really engaging with relevant content to them. And then, like we said, like we had said previously in some of these discussions around, if you can have a hiring manager and engineer, if they're going to meet, if they're going to a conference, go out there and meet with them there. I think we already, we have some engineers going out to the reInvent AWS conference in a couple of weeks. And we have, for instance, someone we just recently hired, but they're, not starting until January, February. Our CTO is, and some people there are going to go have dinner with them, and then network around. So I think, those sort of approaches can be super helpful.
Great. Um, Alexis, what are some sourcing tactics that you've had personal success with, either at Quip or in your past experience when you were at Cisco Meraki?
Yeah, Ben, so I think as you mentioned, personalization is super important and persistence is important. But when you're being persistent, you want to make sure there's prior records or prior emails to that follow-up. But I think the thing that I want to focus on that's been a really big game changer for me with hiring, especially for roles where I've had fairly low response rates, is the send on behalf of feature. And there's a couple ways that you can go about using that feature. You can do it through a tool perhaps like Intello, or you can do it through Gmail and set up an alias. And the way that you go about doing this is if you get a hiring manager on board, because of course you need their permission to send emails on their behalf. But once you do that, if you're able to create a template that's customizable, you can actually reach out to candidates and it'll look as though it's coming from the hiring manager. So I think, both Corey and Ben touched on this, that sometimes technical talent wants to hear from other technical folk that they can more directly relate to. So I noticed that in the past, I've had my response rates shoot up quite a bit from using this, send on behalf of feature. I think the only other thing I want to caution about with that is make sure before you do that you're really clear on what the role is, what it's asking for, what the right skill set is that you're looking for, and to make sure that, you've built trust with your hiring manager to go this extra mile and actually send emails on their behalf.
Great. Yeah, I can say as currently I act as a hiring manager in my current role, and having a great relationship with your recruiters is by far the most important thing in terms of working together as a recruitment team. So I very much appreciate that you really want to be respectful of your hiring manager and make sure that everybody is on the same page, especially when you're doing stuff like that. All right, I think it's got a little bit in there. So if we want to go ahead and move on to our next topic, and we can always come back at the end in Q&A, especially if people have a lot of questions there. So let's talk a little bit about what candidates value in their next opportunity. So I'm going to start here for Corey. As someone who's been on the other end of the recruiting process a few times, can you talk a little bit about what goes through your mind as a candidate, what developers are looking for in a role, in a team, in a company, how you're evaluating recruiters and their pitches as they come to you?
Yeah, something that I'm doing and talking through this with some coworkers recently, we're evaluating throughout the process. So from the very beginning of searching or getting an idea that you might be interested all the way through to getting an offer, there are just lots of different stages of evaluating. So everything that a company presents is important. So early in the process, I'm thinking about location, the industry, what sort of the company's mission is, what they do, a lot of the sort of broad strokes. At Hired, we see a lot of people reject job outreach because of the location, and a lot because of the vertical, because early stage, you're considering those things, they're kind of big considerations. You don't want a giant commute. You want to make sure you're going to be working in something you're passionate about. A little bit later in the process, when I've actually engaged with a company, I've decided that maybe I'll be interested. I'm thinking a lot about the people I'm interacting with, how I get along with them, whether I can see myself spending time with these people, working with them, building a collaborative relationship. Specifically, the manager for the role I'm considering, I know that that's very important for me to feel productive in my job, to have a good relationship with my manager, and I want to sort of feel out that working dynamic. And also in that stage, I'm thinking about the tech stack, sort of the problems and like benefits that a company has based on what technologies they're working with, whether they offer an opportunity to learn something new, or if it's too much of a stretch and outside my sort of comfort zone too far. But also, is it sort of old technologies that I've known for a long time and don't sort of indicate maybe some a lot of legacy code, a lot of technical debt that might not be that fun or easy to work through. And I also think a lot during the interview process about the tactics that companies are using to interview me. So I think being respectful of a candidate and asking interview questions in a way that's well considered and really is measuring and assessing what you're curious about, and not just the standard whiteboarding or sort of older, maybe less effective methods for assessing candidates. I think when I run into sort of partially having a teaching background and having assessed people on lots of stuff, if I run into old assessment techniques, I feel like they are not really measuring for great candidates, and I can't feel very confident that my team members are going to be selected well for their jobs and know that I'm going to be working in a productive team environment. And toward the end of the process, I'm considering all of the above factors, everything about how my process went, all the people I interacted with, as well as my potential for growth at the company, how much I could learn and grow and develop there, what sort of the growth opportunities are. And of course, at the end, an offer and compensation does weigh in and is part of the consideration. But because that comes in later stage, it's usually sort of a consideration at the end of the process, for me at least.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and speak for myself a little bit to sort of reiterate some of the themes you brought up. You mentioned recruiters in a recruiting process that's respectful to the engineer. That's super important. I can't stress that enough. I've had experiences where, a recruiter says, "Hey, this is great, but we've decided that, we're gonna open this position up a month later. So if you could just go on hold for a month, that'd be great." Which is fine for somebody who's passively searching, but at the time I was in an active job search, and for an active candidate, that's just dropping them out of your funnel completely. So you can do things like that as long as you understand where your candidate's coming from and what their job search actually looks like. I've had other experiences where I talked to a company once that was trying some very innovative interview formats. They wanted to do things like have me come in, prepare a tech talk, and deliver to their team, which is interesting and cool, but also homework. And if you're doing 4 or 5 interviews in a week, you don't have time for that. So just making sure that you understand where your candidate's coming from, be respectful of their time. And then the last thing you mentioned, Corey, was compensation. And this is a thing that I like to point out. Occasionally, like on Twitter, you'll see from hiring managers who say that, they really don't want candidates who are going to be picky about compensation. It's kind of nickel and diming when we're already in a very well compensated field. And one thing that I've heard a lot from colleagues who maybe come from underrepresented backgrounds is that sort of a perspective can be really myopic in terms of where your candidates are coming from. So you might have a candidate who isn't under financial pressure, who is willing to be flexible about compensation, or who it's not their first concern. But there are definitely candidates who maybe they come from a place of less financial privilege, maybe they have family obligations or commitments. And so it's completely valid for that to be a first concern for some candidates. And in fact, if you treat that as a first-class concern, you are going to do a better job of making sure you're getting candidates from a wide range of backgrounds, instead of just narrowly people for whom they have the privilege of not having it be sort of their foremost criterion in selecting a job. I don't know, Alexis or Brian, if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I think the compensation is a big piece. I think, just being transparent about it too. And, everyone has different things that make them tick. And I think as recruiters, we have to, it is our responsibility to figure out ultimately what is important to someone. I think we'll touch on that a little bit as we go along here. But, at the end of the day, that is part of our job. What is driving this person to make a move? Is it comp? Is that the thing that's most critical for them? You don't know what their background, like you mentioned, you don't know what their financial background is. Is it that, or is it just, hey, my company just got bought, or is it, hey, the technology is just not cool anymore. We're in maintenance mode. I'm not doing any new projects. I think trying to figure out what that is in an initial call is pretty critical for us.
Yeah, I definitely think that during that initial call, especially as recruiters that we have with candidates, you're really building the foundation of what the rest of the interview experience is going to play out like. So I think it's really important that, we do our due diligence and really just asking, because there's no way to really assume what somebody's going to want, what's important to someone. And I think the only way to really set yourself up for success at the end of the process when you are trying to close is really knowing what that individual person is looking for and what's really going to drive their decision-making process.
Great. So we'll start. This is probably another one more for Brian and Alexis. And Brian, we'll start with you here. As we're talking about what candidates are looking for and how to keep them interested, what in your experience causes people to drop out, to lose interest and exit the process?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that came to mind. What causes a tech candidate to drop out? First, I think not getting a strong idea about the job in the initial recruiter screen. If I get on the phone with an engineer, and they say, well, what is the job? And, you have nothing to say. You just say, oh, here's a tech stack and that's it. You can't say, hey, you're on a team of, 5 to 8 or 20 to 30, and you're working on this part of the product. And these are some of the projects. And you just say, hey, we use C# and AWS and that's it. And, I think you get off that call as an engineer, or I think as anyone, even if I'm interviewing for a job as a recruiter and they can't describe what the role is, I'm like, well, is this something I would even want to pursue any further? Because you basically just gave me no details. So just having something to, we're not going to be able to sit there and talk through, all the technical nitty gritty details with you. But at the same time, you want to have at least a little bit of understanding of some of the interesting challenges that you're going to be taking on if you were to pursue this job. Second, is a slow interview process, and that's huge, especially in a market that is just, for us in Boston, and I'm sure for you guys in San Francisco, candidates go off the market, in sometimes like days. This isn't, interview processes can't take 3-4 weeks, because you're just simply with like 4 or 5 rounds, it's just simply not going to work. You're going to lose people. So one of the things we strive for at DraftKings is to keep the process short, not have too many rounds, and get feedback turned around as soon as possible. So for engineering, after the recruiter call, there's some sort of technical evaluation before an onsite, and then there's an onsite interview, and that's it. The only way that changes is if it's like a very, much more senior role, like a leadership role, that may change. But it's pretty much technical evaluation, onsite interview, done. And then we try to turn around interview feedback within 24 to 48 hours once you come on site. Because once you interview, if we think you're good, we don't want to wait a week to offer you, because by that time you're getting offers from everyone else. And in Boston, just here, for example, if we offer an engineer and we wait a week, they might get offers from Amazon, Facebook, and same thing in the Bay Area, I guess. Amazon, Facebook, CarGurus, Wayfair, they're all getting these offers like boom, 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 versus, hey, you had a great interview, you're feeling great about the job, here's your offer, 1 to 2 days later, I'm still super stoked about it, except off the market. So that's pretty important for us. And then just on a more personal level for DraftKings, our company level, we deal a fair amount here with a lot of brand bias. So that's one of the things that we do on our recruiting team in our first call. And depending on the industry that you're in, there is a lot of brand bias out there. So a lot of people may think of DraftKings as this, bro-y tech company, all these sports bros out there, right? We get that a lot. People may be shy from applying because they're like, I don't, these are just, if you don't love sports, how can you work there? So one of the things we like to talk about in our first call is really how, we are a technology-driven company that does sports. We're not a sports company that just has tech. And talking about some of those technical challenges, because that is something just for us personally that we deal with a lot here, and we have to overcome.
Yeah, I think transparency is really important. And of course, as Brian mentioned, time is of the essence. So you always want to make sure to move quickly. But I think another reason that sometimes people tend to drop out, so I mentioned earlier that I'm really passionate about building diverse teams and creating an inclusive interview process. I think, when you're talking to candidates, you want to make sure that you're also explaining how you're looking for people who are culture adds versus culture fits. I think sometimes, if you're talking a lot about the culture of your company and you're pitching it as very one-noted, you can really turn away a lot of people who feel like because, maybe they're different from the culture that you're pitching, that they won't be able to fit in there or be successful or, be a part of a culture that's going to support them in their growth.
Great. Yeah, I think again, as a candidate, I definitely hear talking about a slow interview process. I've definitely had issues with that in the past with companies who took too much time. One thing that, from the candidate's perspective, I've had reasonable experiences with companies that needed more time as long as they were able to explain to me why. So a quick email from the hiring manager saying, "Hey, we've got a big leadership summit or whatever. It's going to take us a week to get back to you." Or we've been asked to rebalance a couple things. I won't have an answer for you this week, but next Monday expect to hear something. And at least keeping people in the loop, I think, can do a lot to sort of mitigate that problem when it does exist. I don't know, Corey, if you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, totally. And I think letting a candidate know that, you'd hope to turn it around faster or, and always just keeping expectations clear that this is going to be the timing, this is why, and just that transparency is really appreciated. It shows a culture of transparency that's going to be beneficial to your growth at a job as well.
Okay, so continuing on, Corey, what helps keep you in a role, and then what are sort of your triggers when you start sort of looking for a new one, whether it's sort of a very active, engaged search or sort of a gentler, passive search?
Yeah, I think growth is a good way to frame reasons for sticking around, both personal growth and company growth. If a role is or a company is growing and changing, and the role stays exciting, and I'm being asked to do new things, I'm feeling like I'm learning. I feel like I have good working relationships with the people around me. I think those are all really good reasons for sticking around, for staying. Things are interesting and novel continuously as I go. Those are good feelings. First, stagnation is something that will make me feel like I want to leave. Stagnation on the company level, where it doesn't feel like the team is making progress, or it doesn't feel like my contributions are pushing things forward, or that we're growing as a team. But also personal stagnation is also a feeling that I really want to avoid as an engineer, knowing that the best thing I can do is just keep climbing the growth and learning curve. And if I find myself plateauing a little bit, that's a signal to me to start considering something new. Maybe start that passive job search. A couple of other things that make me feel like I want to stay: feeling that my contributions are helping, that my contributions matter, that things that I'm doing are appreciated, and that when I bring up problems or issues at a larger level, that there is effort to generally move forward on changing those problems and working to break down the sort of larger problems, because every company goes through challenges, and as someone who's trying to bring up those challenges and figure out how to solve them, if others are also doing that, that's a promising thing. If not, that's a pretty quick sort of trigger for me to think about what my next role might be.
You talked a little bit about growth opportunity, and how to make sure that you as an engineer are continuing to develop, which is actually a really nice segue. Alexis, do you want to talk a little bit about how you explain growth opportunities for candidates?
Yeah, I think that the first most important thing to mention is that growth isn't something that's one size fits all. You'll need to have different growth paths available for people based on what their interests are. So before you go and pitch a specific growth track, you want to understand what the individual wants to accomplish. do they want to move into management? Do they want flexibility to work across the stack? Is there a certain technology, on your roadmap that they want to get more exposure to? So I think it's really important just to have at least a short list of selling points that you can tailor to an individual's needs. In addition to that, I think it's also really important to make sure that as recruiters, we're staying on top of what the trends are in the market and what some of the most appealing, technologies or tools or projects are out there, so that you can understand how what your company has to offer aligns with some of the most appealing things in the market. I think one of the really exciting things that we do here at Quip and larger within Salesforce as a company is we have something that's basically the equivalent of an internal career fair. So we want to make sure that we're really encouraging growth, not only within your own role, but if you feel like you've gotten to a point, as Corey mentioned, where you're plateauing or you're not really learning or there isn't the availability to continue growing, you can look at exploring a new team within the company. And we've set it up in a way that you can make a smooth transition without burning any bridges between your former manager and your new potential manager. And I think that's something that's allowed us to help in keeping people more broadly within Salesforce, but also within Quip, working across some of our different personas and groups.
Yeah, and then just to add on, just not too much, I think I echo everything Alexis is saying. I think having those individual contributor versus management career paths are really important, especially when you're hiring, maybe a senior software engineer, who's close to being in that next phase of their career. Not every engineer wants to be a manager or director of engineering. A lot of them, want to be just hands-on. They might want to be principal engineers or whatever other staff engineers, whatever title, a company uses. Not everyone's interested in just being in management. So you have to be able to provide some individual contributor career paths. DraftKings does a really good job of that here, where, we have, from a campus hire up to like a vice president of engineering and having, 8 to 10 categories in each level of, what that person is expected to do in each role to help provide some guidance on, okay, if you want to go the manager route, this is what's expected. If you want to go from lead to senior lead to principal, these are all the steps that you have to do in order to get there. And then I think that internal growth as well. If you work on one product, but your company's coming out with another product or spinning up a new team, providing that opportunity, because there's, obviously there's the upward mobility, but I think also having that lateral mobility within a company to be able to just go work on new projects where it's not just growing your title, but it's growing your skill set, and working on something new. Maybe your team is spinning up a new mobile app, and you need some developers that, just internally, maybe haven't done mobile dev, but are interested in it. And maybe having them make the move over there to start working on that and build some of those foundational skills. I think that can be very helpful in an organization as well.
Great. So moving along, as we're starting to get a little tight on time and we want to make sure we hit everything. So let's talk about interviews a little bit. Brian, let's go ahead and start with you on this one. Once you have a candidate's attention and interest, how do you keep them engaged and excited through the process?
Yeah, it's really that constant communication and that continual follow-up. And a lot of it's based on that first call, understanding what's motivating their job search. What are their concerns about their job now, about working at your company potentially, and then trying to make your pitch based off of that, and then constantly reminding them of that. If they say, hey, I'm a little bit concerned about this or that, you have that reference to go back and say, well, when we spoke, last week, you really mentioned that, location was, is the biggest reason you're looking to make a move. So I know you say, you're a little bit hesitant, but have you, really thought about what, location again? Because that was a key driver for you. So don't forget what was driving you in the first place. I think Alexis touched on a lot of this earlier as well, but sharing company news and developments. If your company is doing a lot of new things and they're in the news a lot, share those articles, those blogs. Hey, here's what's going on now. We were doing this last week, but here's this super new cool thing we just rolled out or we're working on. and keeping that going. And then, again, something we touched on, but moving the process along quickly and turning around feedback quickly. Because the longer you wait, and if you go 1 or 2 weeks between interviews, and there's not a clear explanation as to why, that can really drop someone's interest, because you just kind of lose all of that momentum.
Great. And then I know as a developer, sometimes you can get a very wide range in terms of how technically fluent recruiters can be, from some who are very, very well versed to others who are maybe a little bit less so. Alexis, do you have any tips or advice on how a recruiter can sort of bridge that gap, how a recruiter can stay educated and aware? Are there any questions you make sure to ask? Is there language you specifically try to avoid?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was actually sitting down yesterday with someone on my team yesterday talking about some of this. But I think, some of the people who know me personally too know that I love doing a lot of reading, a lot of research. Oftentimes when I come into the office every day, I'll ask, oh, did you hear about this acquisition, or have you heard about this? And I think the way that I've gone about structuring my day is making sure that I'm setting up my Google alerts. I'm subscribing to new newsletters like TechCrunch or Hired, Stack Overflow, Hacker News, etc., and making sure that you're actually taking some time, in the morning or at some point throughout the week, to actively put in that effort to learn a little bit about what's going on in the industry. And then from learning from a definition perspective of what a certain tool or maybe a coding language is, there's a really great Chrome extension called Glossary Tech. And you can use it in conjunction with LinkedIn, where you can pull up a LinkedIn page and it'll highlight various technical words on the page and it'll give you what the definitions are. But in addition to that, it'll show you what a similar tool might be. So if you're new, it really helps with pattern matching, and being able to understand, what a particular tool is and how you can find something similar. And one other thing that I think is really important for bridging the gap. So I'm somebody who always makes sure to take 30 minutes a day to go sit down and have lunch. And the reason I do that is, of course, to take a break throughout the day, but also to spend time with some of the other people on the team and in the company. Here at Clip, I often sit down with some of our engineers or engineering managers and then get to know them a little bit better, understanding, what type of tech stack they like working with, certain projects they're excited about, or if there's anything on the roadmap that they think is really attractive to either them or maybe to external candidates. I think really just taking that time to educate yourself is going to going a long way, and it's really going to set you up for success. And I think the last thing that I'll mention, as far as language to avoid, just make sure not to label or pigeonhole people. Just because someone might be a back-end engineer, for example, right now, don't assume that that's all that they're capable of or that's all that they want to do. And if you're not familiar with a certain technology, don't pretend to know what it is. Usually the other person that you're talking to is going to catch on to that, and they're going to know that you're not aware. And I think, Ben and Corey can probably speak to this, but, I think they'll understand if you tell them and they're talking about something really technical and you say, to be honest, that goes a little bit beyond my technical depth. I'd love for you to explain it to me or tell me a little bit more about it. Or even better yet, your next call is going to be with an engineer. I'd love for you to spend some time talking to them about that.
Yeah, so that actually leads a little bit into our last question here before we get to our audience Q&A, which is a little bit about actual interview practice. Whiteboard interviews, take-home tests. You mentioned asking the engineer to actually explain things to you, which I've seen some pretty nice interview processes that involve sort of testing a candidate on their ability to clearly communicate and fluently explain ideas. So that's actually a case where you can sort of build that in a little bit into how you do an assessment. But so, Corey, you and I, I'm sure, have a lot of strong feelings. What do you think a good practical assessment really looks like during the interview process?
Yeah, I think a task that is matching what you're trying to measure for and the mode of communication is really important. So, Ben, you just mentioned if you're looking to measure communication, having someone talking and possibly whiteboarding is okay. If you're asking someone to code, it's not so great to ask them to do that on a whiteboard. If you're, for me, ideal assessments that involve coding, I like to sit down with someone. I like to work with an engineer, spend time with some code that's already there. It's not often that I spin up code from scratch, and it's not often that I'm probably going to do that too much in your code base because there's stuff already there. So starting with existing code, give me some idea. Maybe it's some legacy code that a problem that you'd solved in the past, but you sort of froze in that state for an interview, and sitting down with an engineer and talking through and working through a problem with that piece of code. I like it when all web resources are available. I use Google all the time when I'm working, and so I like cutting that out is giving you an artificial look at who I am and what I'm capable of. And I also really appreciate when I've been given some idea of what to expect beforehand, whether it's just like the category of problem that we're going to be working on, the type of exercise we're going to be doing. That expectation setting is really important for me because I can prepare a little bit, and it's a little more like what it would be like for me to do a task in my everyday job. I would get ready and prepare to do something well, and giving me the opportunity to do that beforehand, even if it's just a small, like, hey, think about these categories of, look at this algorithm, for example, or this design pattern. Giving something to think about beforehand to make me feel like, okay, I'm not walking into complete unknown. And I also really have appreciated in the past, I've had a couple interviews that started out with a task that was pretty easy, but then had lots of depth if you kept peeling back more layers. So it was easy to get feelings of success throughout that process and feel like working with the interviewer was productive, and also that we were practicing sort of an iterative approach to solving this problem where a first quick and dirty version is fine, and then how would you refactor it? How would you improve it? What feature would you add? That sort of interview is more fun for, I think, both parties. You probably get a little more novelty out of it. It's maybe a little harder to create that interview and takes a lot of really intentional thinking to decide how you're going to assess somebody in that way. But I think that it's worth it for the experience you create. People, whether you say yes or no to them after that process, are going to leave happier and be more interested in coming back later and become, part of your longer term pipeline as well. Yeah, another thing I really like if there's time or opportunity to get a little bit of feedback on the work that I did. So if an engineer actually takes a moment to either after the interview send me an email or during, set aside 5 minutes to say, hey, I really liked how you did this part. I thought you could have done this differently. I appreciate that. It's an opportunity to learn a lot of the time interviewing with people that show you that they're interested in helping their coworkers learn and helping, helping their teammates grow. I think is a really good thing to show in that interview process.
Yeah, I'll say I agree a lot with all of that, especially that last bit about interview feedback. I think it's really important to give candidates feedback. I also think it's really important to be asking candidates for feedback about how to improve your interview process, because that's a thing that none of us in this industry do nearly enough in terms of making it a better and more humane experience for everybody. So to zip along a little bit here, because we're a little bit over time and we have a lot of audience questions actually, and I don't know if we are willing to go a little over or not. I don't know if anybody built in time, but moving along to get to our questions. So we have been asked to put up an SHRM code for those of us in the audience who do use this. So if anybody needs that, you can record that now. Give you a quick second for that, and Q&A. So we've got a lot here. So our first question from Jacqueline for Brian and Alexis, and maybe we can just hit these sort of quickly so we can get through all of them. What are your 3 most used sourcing tools? Let's go ahead and start with Brian first and then Alexis.
Probably LinkedIn. We do invest pretty heavily in Hired. We have the yearly plan, so we do use Hired quite frequently for engineering. As well as we are starting to invest in Intello, which we feel is going to be a really good tool to just grab candidates' information that might not be available just through a LinkedIn, and using that to reach out. And that is kind of paired with your ATS CRM type tool.
I agree with Brian. LinkedIn, Intello, and hired. I think those are three really great tools that I absolutely love using.
Great. Next up, question from Graham for Corey and myself, and you can go ahead and start, Corey. What resources should I use to stay up to date on tech trends and cool projects?
Yeah, I read Hacker News. I think that that's a great resource because the stuff there is so varied. Other resources, I have a couple of emails coming in from Startup Digest that I check in once in a while. Yeah, those are the two that come to mind immediately. Yeah, how about you, Ben?
I personally really don't have enough patience for Hacker News, so I try to stay away from it myself. I follow a lot of tech Twitter. A bunch of folks who I have respected from previous technical communities, sort of watching along on where they've gone to. I tend to find that really is often enough for me in terms of hearing what people are moving on to most quickly. All right, Lindsay asks for Brian, when talking about your quick hiring process, how many interviewers do you have at the on-site stage?
Right now it is 4. So we have 2 technical interviews and then 2 more conversation-based interviews. So the interview typically will go about, I would say about 3.5 to 4 hours. The technicals both last an hour, and then the 2 conversations are 45 minutes and 30 minutes. But you get exposed to all facets of the business there. You'll meet an individual contributor engineer. You'll probably meet like a lead. You'll meet probably a manager and a director on site. So all levels you'll get exposed to.
Great. We have a question from Hannah for Alexis. When do you first bring compensation into the conversation?
Yeah, I usually bring it up in the first conversation towards the very end of the conversation. So I think it's important to try to build rapport with someone first before jumping into that subject, because it can be a little bit uncomfortable. And I think something that's really helpful to get that information from someone is when you're talking about it, you can say, hey, what are you looking for in terms of compensation? The reason I want to ask you this is I really want to be respectful of what you're looking for, and I want to be respectful of your time. So if we can get some sort of range, we can make sure we're both aligned on that front. And I think in asking it in that way, it becomes really helpful and people are more comfortable disclosing. I think sometimes there's a little bit of a concern from people thinking that if they share that information with you early on, like you might lowball them or you might somehow use that information against them.
All right. Another follow-up on comp from Hannah. Corey, when do you expect to hear about compensation in the recruiting process as a candidate?
Yeah, I actually expect that conversation going into talking to anyone on the phone or in person. I prepare for that conversation early in an interview because different companies have had different approaches, but I've had many take the approach that Alexis is talking about and being upfront and transparent about making sure there's alignment. So I make sure to prepare for that conversation at the beginning of my process. And that's part of my consideration when I start thinking about searching. I try to set numbers in my head and just sort of set down what makes sense to me.
Great. Question from Matt for a bunch of us, but I think in the interest of time, maybe Alexis, you can field this one. How have you built trust between hiring managers and recruiters at your companies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think something that I noticed and learned really early on in my career, because I used to report into somebody who was from a technical background, spend time evaluating the data and understanding the effects of your recruiting process and of your sourcing efforts. I think being able to present that information and be educated about what's happening on the back end of all your efforts is really important. And I think a lot of hiring managers really respect that. And I think one other thing too, like whenever you're going into a meeting with a hiring manager, have some sort of an agenda or end goals or things that you want to accomplish so that you show that you're coming in prepared and that you're being really respectful of their time, especially oftentimes when they're really busy too.
All right, and our last question, which is directed at Brian and Alexis from John. How do you approach negotiating salary when a candidate asks for more money than the hiring manager provided?
Yeah, it's always a fun one. I think there's a few ways. I think you have to understand the candidate's perspective, but also understand the hiring manager perspective. What is the reason we won't go higher internally? Is it internal comp bands? Is it internal equity? Is it just you didn't think they were strong enough to give them that sort of salary? So understanding what internally is driving that decision, and then communicating back with that candidate. Why we were at a certain range. If someone's way above what we can pay, we'll be very transparent and say, this is just unfortunately outside of our compensation band. We just can't get to this sort of number. But we'll also look at other options. We'll look at, is there a way to do a sign on, can we do a sign on bonus? So trying to get the manager on board, if they don't want to go up a base, can we do a sign on or, whatever it may be. And then going back to the candidate and just kind of speaking with them and say, hey, if we can't raise the base, but we do this, would that get you here? And just trying to make some sort of good faith effort. If that the number is just unrealistic for you to get to, trying to see if there's somehow you can meet in the middle or just make some sort of, show of good faith that you'll be able to get them there.
Yeah, and I think one other really important thing, in addition to what Brian has mentioned, is I always try to get an actual number from someone. So, the candidate might say, hey, I want more. And I'm like, okay, so what is more to you? What's a number that you would be happy with as far as maybe base salary or stock or whatever component it might be? Because it's really hard to just keep increasing it. Like your hiring manager is going to get frustrated, recruiters get frustrated because you basically just get into a bidding war at that point. So I think early on, if you try to set some groundwork about a certain number that you're trying to work towards or get close to, you can dial back a little bit on the back and forth and really just try to get to the most fair offer for both the company and the candidate.
Yeah, and understanding that why is the candidate coming back to that number? What is the reason for this? Is it, is it because this is, around where where you're at now and that's this raise for you? Is it, you just looked on, you just looked up salaries at a certain company and you say, this is what I should be paid now. What is where are you getting to that number? How are you getting to that specific salary number to kind of figure out where that request is coming from?
All right, well, now we're a couple minutes over time, but thanks everybody who stuck around with us. Thank you to our panelists, a hand for Alexis, Corey, and Brian. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to send them to our gracious host, matt.mcdonald@hired.com. Or you can look for any of the four of us on LinkedIn or on Twitter. You can reach out. I'm happy to answer questions anytime. Thank you, everybody, for attending and listening in. I hope this was helpful. And have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.